Let's jump into this panel, though. This is a very full panel. There probably isn't going to be a lot of time for Q&A because there is so much content in this session. There is one announcement I want to make before we jump into it, and that is people interested in dynamic systems modeling of world energy flows, please meet with Dick Lawrence. Dick, are you? Okay, please meet with Dick Lawrence at the 9:45 a.m. break this morning in the outdoor area by the pool. Okay, so we look forward to that. Our first speaker on the panel this morning, and the panel is looking at sort of so where do we go from here? Looking at the roles that natural gas and coal and biofuels could play in so where do we go from here in that storyline. Our first speaker is David Hughes. He is a geologist, had 35 years experience studying the energy resources of Canada for the Geological Survey of Canada and the private sector. He's the leader, was the leader of the National Coal Inventory. Don't know if you still are, given that you just retired in April or May. That's a digital knowledge base on coal used to determine the availability of resources for conventional and non-conventional uses, including coal bed methane production and the sequestration of CO2. In past years, David has made presentations on natural gas at previous conferences, and we look forward to his remarks here. Please welcome David Hughes.
Thanks very much, Steve. It's, as usual, a real pleasure to be here and to see so many people turn out, especially so early in the morning on the second day. I'm going to talk about coal, a dirty four-letter word amongst many people. I'd like to look firstly at a 19th century view of coal. This is a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1850. Every basket of coal is power and civilization, for coal is a portable climate. It carries the heat of the tropics to Labrador and the polar circle, and it is the means of transporting itself whithersoever it is wanted. A half ounce of coal will draw 2 tons a mile, and coal carries coal by rail or by boat to make Canada as warm as Calcutta, and with its comfort brings its industrial power. The 21st century view of coal. Coal is the enemy of the human race. The only practical way to keep CO2 below or close to the dangerous level is to phase out coal used during the next few decades, except where CO2 is captured and sequestered. James Hansen, one of the chief scientists in the climate change debate. Some 21st century coal realities. China has completed a coal plant each week recently and plans 500 more within 6 years. India has plans for 200 new plants over the same period. In the US, although 59 of 151 new coal plants planned in 2007 have been canceled, 28 are under construction, and 66 more are planned. New coal plants are planned in Europe, 16 in Germany alone. There are many more planned, especially in the developing world. Seaborne thermal coal supplies are tight, and prices have more than doubled in the past 2 years, as we saw yesterday. The top 3 global coal producers, China, the US, and India, are now importing coal, although the US is still a slight net exporter. So I'd like to cover the following points: a bit of history of coal, the kickoff fuel for the Industrial Revolution, coal's role in the 20th century, the present, coal's role in today's energy mix. It's now the #2 source of primary energy in the world. The future, why coal is unlikely to go away, but what must be done to intelligently manage coal use, and some observations going forward. If you look at the big picture of the human race, you can see what an anomalous period the human race is in relative to its evolution over the last 12,000 years. For example, we came out of the Ice Age, 10,000 years BC, with 3 million people. It took us 6,500 years to get to 10 million. We figured out agriculture. By the time of Christ, there was 200 million people. We figured out coal in about the 1700s. 18 billion people in 1810, that's only 200 years ago. 3 billion in 1957. 6.7 billion at present. We don't think this is an anomalous period because this is all we've ever experienced, but it truly is in terms of the history of humankind. Population and energy consumption, 1,500 to 2,000. The correlation between population growth and the use of hydrocarbons is extremely high correlation. Coal came on in a big way in about 1700, oil, 1860, natural gas in 1885. And since that time, we've really continued an exponential upward climb in consumption of energy. If you look at the past 4 decades, we can see that consumption of energy in the world has almost tripled. Huge growth in the Asia-Pacific, lesser growth in Europe and North America because our consumption levels are already very high. By fuel, oil, #1 source of energy in the world, followed by coal and natural gas. And together, hydrocarbons are about 89% of our primary energy consumption. If we look at the forecast, this is the EIA demand-based forecast, which has been talked about yesterday, basically an extrapolation of trends from the past to the future. A friend of mine who's a senior exploration manager in the oil patch in Calgary relates this type of forecast to what he calls the turkey syndrome. Turkeys live in a nice warm barn. They get fed 2 meals a day. If you project the future from the past, the future looks just great for turkeys. But it's impossible to forecast Thanksgiving based on an analysis of the past. If we look at the reference case forecast of the EIA, their suggestion is that the OECD countries, 18% of global population, now consume 52% of the world's energy. The non-OECD countries, the developing world, 82% of world population, will be consuming 59% of the world's energy by 2030, so nearly a doubling in the developing world. Forecast by fuel, coal is the fastest growing hydrocarbon fuel source going forward, 65% growth by 2030, followed by natural gas and oil. Nuclear and hydro and true renewables will be a relatively small proportion of total energy consumption. If we look at the last 150 years of consumption, this is per capita consumption of the average world citizen by fuel. We can see that in 1850, 90% of consumption was wood. In 2008, 89% of consumption was non-renewable fuels, coal, oil, gas, and uranium. It's interesting to note that the average world citizen consumes the same amount of renewable energy today as he did in 1850. However, the average citizen is consuming 8.3 times as much energy. I gave a talk in Nova Scotia in March, and at the end of the talk, somebody who should have known better said, "Dave, tell us what's the next big thing." Coal replaced wood, and oil replaced coal. What's next? I said, no. Coal didn't replace wood. We're using the same amount of wood now in total than we were in 1850, if not more. The average world citizen uses the same amount of coal per capita as he did in 1910. The only thing that oil did was add to our total per capita consumption level. Natural gas added further, and uranium further still. So the concept of how sustainable is this when 89% of our energy consumption is non-renewable, all of which are likely to peak sometime in the first half of this century, is not very sustainable going forward. And this is what I call the energy sustainability dilemma. Compared to 1850, there's 5.3 times as many people in the world. Each person is consuming 8.6 times as much energy. The world consumes 45 times as much energy as in 1850, 89% of which is non-renewable. Coal, 2/3 of what's left of the world's remaining hydrocarbon energy. 29% of world primary energy consumption in 2007, projected to be the fastest growing fuel source through 2030. Used for electricity generation more so than any other fuel, also as primary heat and in the steel industry. Lowest cost heat source, much lower cost than gas or oil, especially mine mouth coal. Achilles heel of coal, of course, is carbon footprint. Double the carbon footprint of gas using conventional technologies. With advanced clean coal technologies, the carbon footprint can be reduced almost to that of gas, but cost money. Nonetheless, as I mentioned, it has been the fastest growing hydrocarbon fuel source recently. Coal consumption in the world has grown by 33% since year-end 2002. People think of coal as a 19th century fuel. This is the total consumption of coal by the human race through year-end 2007. And it's interesting to note that 90% of that coal has been consumed since 1910, half of it since 1972, and 10% of it since 2002. So coal certainly was the fuel of the 20th century, and it's looking like it may also be the fuel of the 21st. Production and consumption of coal, the last 2.5 decades of production and consumption. Huge growth, primarily in the Asia-Pacific region, both in production and consumption of coal, and lesser growth in North America in both production and consumption. EIA forecast for coal growth through 2030. 65% growth is their reference case forecast. If we convert hydrocarbons to their energy content, about 1/3 of the hydrocarbon energy that we used in 2007 was coal. 57% of what's left of the world's hydrocarbon reserves is coal. And as Jim said yesterday, both coal, oil and gas are about equivalent in terms of remaining hydrocarbon energy. If we look at the distribution of hydrocarbon energy around the world, we can see that North America is the Middle East of coal, as is the Asia Pacific. Coal is generally fairly evenly distributed around the world, with the notable exception of the Middle East. The Middle East doesn't have any coal. On a cost per unit of heat basis, coal is cheap relative to oil or gas. Natural gas today is priced at less than half of the heat equivalent of oil. Export thermal coal has increased quite a bit recently, but it's still much cheaper than natural gas. Some of the mine mouth coal power plants that we use in Alberta, for example, are about 1/10 the cost of natural gas on a heat basis. North American coal production by energy content and by tonnage. Because the Appalachian coals, which are generally higher calorific value coals, are declining, and that production is being made up for by lower ranked coals from the Powder River Basin and the Midwest. The energy content of coal mined in North America actually peaked in 1998. And on a tonnage basis, we had a peak to date in 2006. And that doesn't mean it can't be turned around by building more infrastructure and more mines. That's a possibility in future. The U.S. is now importing, I think, about 30 million tons a year of coal from Colombia, but it is also exporting coal. If we look at net exports of U.S. coal, they've declined from about 20% of production in 1981. They were briefly negative in 2003, and they're now about 3% positive. So the U.S. is still a slight net energy exporter, net coal energy exporter. How much recoverable coal is there in the U.S.? There's a recent study by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences back in June of 2007 said it's clear that there's enough coal at current rates of production to meet anticipated needs through 2030, and probably enough for 100 years. However, it's not possible to confirm the oft-quoted assertion that there's a sufficient supply for the next 250 years. Recent programs to assess coal recoverability in limited areas using updated methods indicate that only a small fraction of previously estimated reserves are actually recoverable if you put all of the cookie cutters on that restrict access to those coals. A couple of studies have been done on global coal resources and coal deliverability. This is one by the Energy Watch Group published in 2007, suggesting a peak in coal deliverability in 2025 globally, a peak in China as soon as 2020. And this was revolutionary. The conventional urban legends had coal as the fuel of thousands of years. And I've spent a lot of my working life as a geoscientist on coal. And I can tell you that that's likely not true, based on an assessment of all of Canada's coal resources. Another study, this was in preprint version earlier this year by Uppsala, suggesting a global peak in coal deliverability in 2030, a peak in China somewhat earlier, possibly 2025. We heard from Dave Rutledge of Caltech in Houston last year, and Dave has used Hubbert linearization on coal and on oil and gas, and concluded we have about 1.6 trillion barrels oil equivalent of recoverable coal remaining, and 4.7 trillion barrels oil equivalent of all hydrocarbons, oil, gas, and coal. He concluded that if we burn them as fast as we can produce them, 90% of them will be gone in 2076. He also concluded that the IPCC estimates of the amount of recoverable coal used in their calculation of carbon in the atmosphere was overstated by 6 or 7 times. There's not enough available recoverable carbon to even hit the lowest IPCC level of carbon in the atmosphere. And this was his projection. There's 40 IPCC models of carbon in the atmosphere. And this is the projection burning all of the hydrocarbons as fast as they can be produced. And what this would indicate that of the two problems, climate change and energy sustainability, the energy sustainability issue is by far the nearest and likely most severe in terms of our generation and the next generation. And if we can deal with the energy sustainability problem rationally, we'll take care of the carbon problem by default. Electricity growth, EIA global forecast again. China, nearly quadruple. India, triple. The rest of the developing world in Asia, outside of China and India, double. The industrialized world, real growth of 37%, but constituting only 41% of global electricity generation by 2030. World electricity generation by fuel, coal by far the largest source of generation. 46% of market share by 2030. Natural gas will grow hugely to 25%. Nuclear will grow in real terms, but will contract in terms of market share in this forecast. Hydro and true renewables will grow in real terms and also contract in market share. U.S. generation, coal, again, extremely important. This forecast was published in June, suggesting that 57% of U.S. generation will be coal by 2030. Real growth in nuclear, but a decline in market share. Real growth in hydro and true renewables, and an increase in market share. The EIA recognizes the problem with generation from natural gas and is forecasting a contraction going forward. The generating capacity expansion in the North American grid by fuel. The North American Electricity Reliability Corporation, most of the capacity built over the last decade was natural gas, 90% of it. Going forward, there'll still be some gas, a lot more coal, a lot of wind, some nuclear, and true renewables. What about clean coal? We heard yesterday that David thought that clean coal was an oxymoron. How clean is clean coal? It turns out with the highest efficiency generation technologies can lower CO2 emissions by about 25%. Cleanup of things like particulates is about 99%, 99% in SOx, 90% in NOx, and 90% in mercury. The most cost-efficient current technology is ultra-supercritical combustion at about 43.5% efficient compared to 34% efficient for a 60s-era subcritical plant. Denmark is a world leader in ultra-supercritical plants and utilizes them in district heating applications with combined efficiencies of over 70% in some cases. So if you can use the waste heat out of a coal plant, it increases the overall efficiency radically. Clean coal technologies to reduce emissions coupled with a very aggressive conservation and efficiency program may make more sense than carbon capture and storage at the scale that would allow business as usual to exist for a few more years. Challenges with carbon capture and storage, or CCS, from coal plants in an energy and money constrained world. Let's do the math. This is some data from an MIT study called The Future of Coal, and it indicates the parasitic power losses to capture and compress CO2 from different coal burning technologies. For example, fitting CCS to an ultra-supercritical plant uses about 27% of the energy in that plant. IGCC, 38% efficient, is really the lowest parasitic power loss at 23%. It costs a lot more to build plants with CCS. An ultra-supercritical plant will cost 54% more to build. An IGCC plant will cost 32% more to build. So again, IGCC is really the cheapest in both parasitic power loss and increased capital cost of the plant going forward. Let's do the math. Let's compare the best technology with heat capture versus IGCC with CCS and without heat capture. Ultra supercritical, 43.3% efficient. If we can intelligently locate it so we can use the waste heat, we're looking at an overall efficiency of 70%. Compared to an old coal plant, just by using the best technology and intelligently locating the plant for waste heat capture, we can reduce CO2 emissions by 51% over old coal. IGCC, 38.4% efficient. If we fit it with CCS, we knock down the efficiency to 31%. We should be able to capture at least 85% of the emissions out of that plant. It costs us 39% more to build. It will burn 124% more fuel over the life of that plant. We have additional capital and energy overhead with CCS, pipeline transfers, building pipelines, injection wells, long-term monitoring, operating costs, and maintenance of a complex disposal system. And that's not counting the CO2 emissions associated with, if you use coal, mining and burning 124% more coal and transporting it to the power plant. Proponents of CCS often assume there is no energy problem. We have lots of energy to cover the parasitic power loss. A couple of quotes from some CCS promoters in Canada. Conventional oil supplies will peak sometime, but this does not mean there's any shortage of energy. We have enough coal and gas to supply energy at twice our current burn rates for several centuries. And of course, if we did that without CCS, we would wreck the climate. When coal is included, there are perhaps 1,000 years of fossil fuels remaining at today's use rates, and almost 500 years if consumption grows, as in the current trends projection. And these are totally unsubstantiated comments published in the media. Pragmatists point out the issues of scale and complexity with CCS. Vaclav Smil, in an article published in Nature in May, Carbon sequestration is irresponsibly portrayed as an imminently useful large-scale option for solving the challenge. But to sequester just 25% of CO2 emitted in 2005 by large stationary sources of the gas, we would have to create a system whose annual throughput by volume would be slightly more than twice that of the world's crude oil industry, an undertaking that would take many decades to accomplish. Another comment that's very important in all of our go-forward consideration, Vaclav Smil again, beware of scale. The message: managing carbon and global warming by energy-intensive and complex means such as CCS and uncontrolled geoengineering experiments with shields in space, seeding the atmosphere with sulfate crystals and seeding the oceans with iron filings, only compound and exacerbate the energy issue. The simplest and lowest tech method to reduce carbon emissions is not to burn them in the first place, to conserve hydrocarbons by every conceivable method possible. And intelligent, energy-efficient uses of coal are paramount, for it is certain that coal will be with us for a long time. Business, as usual, likely has a limited lifespan, and the sooner we realize this, the less chaotic the final transition will be. Some final observations on sustainability. Population, this is history in black, 1965 to present, forecast in future. China will top out at a little over 1.4 billion people by 2030. India will become the most populous country on the planet by 2030. The rest of developing Asia will reach nearly 1.4 billion people. Europe will flatten out. North America will continue to grow, or the US will continue to grow, as will Canada. Per capita consumption in the world, China is forecast to nearly double its per capita consumption. And if it does that, it will still only be about half of Europe and about a quarter of the US and a fifth of Canada. I'd like to point out, as has been done already, how efficient Europe is by comparison to the US, less than half of US per capita consumption levels. Total consumption, if China can exceed in increasing its per capita consumption by nearly double, China will be the largest energy consumer on the planet by 2030 if there's enough hydrocarbons to make that happen, allow that to happen. US Bureau of Census, the world's population is not forecast to stop growing in 2030. It will be over 9 billion people by 2050. We're adding 75 million people per year to the planet at present. And we're also adding a lot of cars. 850 million cars in the world at present. Nearly as many new cars built as people added to the planet in 2007. If we return to the dilemma, 5.3 times as many people, consuming 8.6 times as much energy per capita, 45 times the consumption as in 1850. If you believe the EIA forecasts that I've been showing you, this is what the world will look like in 2030. 6.7 times as many people, each person consuming 9.7 times as much energy. A world that consumed 65 times as much energy as in 1850. 89% non-renewable, all of which will peak sometime in the first half of this century. I don't think many people in the room would agree that that scenario is sustainable in any way, shape, or form. And that brings me to a very famous statement that Kenneth Boulding made in the 70s. Anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. And Al Bartlett, who is an absolute icon, the term sustainable growth is an oxymoron. I'm really sorry that Al couldn't be here today. I knew he was planning on being here. I had the pleasure of being at a workshop with Al about a year ago, spent 3 days with them. A workshop on the conversion of climate and energy. There was 4 of us concerned with energy at this meeting. Besides Al, there was Ed Schreier, the founder of ASPO Canada, and Joseph Tainter, the author of a definitive book on the collapse of complex societies, and about 26 climate change aficionados. We spend a lot of time talking with each other. I think it's worthwhile looking at some of Joseph Tainter's concepts on why complex societies collapse. He spent a lot of time looking at the Roman Empire, and he has some definitions: sustainability, the capacity to continue a desired condition of process, social or ecological. Resilience is the ability of a system to adjust its configuration and function under disturbance. Complexity is the differentiation of social systems in both structure and behavior, and or degree of organization or constraint. Collapse, a rapid simplification, the loss of an established level of social, political, or economic complexity. Ever-increasing complexity is one problem-solving solution to sustainability, provided the resources are available to pay for it, both in financial and energy terms. Eventually, however, the resources become diminished such that investment in increasing complexity pay marginal or no energy returns. At this point, simplicity is imposed, which can either be a managed transition through intelligent planning, resilience, or an unmanaged chaotic transition, collapse. The sustainability game. In a sustainability exercise, it's possible to lose, to become unsustainable. The converse does not hold. There's no point at which a sustainability exercise has been won. Success consists of staying in the game, that is, continuing the ability to solve problems for which we need energy resources, and the more the better. Investments in increasing complexity have paid huge dividends since the Renaissance, and particularly since the Industrial Revolution, thanks largely to fossil fuels and uranium. The party is getting close to last call. We have seen the energy return on energy investment on incremental energy expenditures decrease radically, even over the last decade. It's been a great ride, but it's time to move on to a new, more sustainable paradigm, which leaves us with two crucial questions. Will we think our way out of this with a power-down reversion to greater simplicity, resilience, or will we keep the pedal to the metal, collapse? Thank you very much. 30 seconds over.
I appreciate very much David's remarks and his ability to compress an enormous amount of information in a short period of time. Someone last year described sitting in the audience feeling like a punching bag with a very efficient automated punching machine, just taking one slug after another, yet with a total worldview, which is laudatory. I appreciate in particular your closing remarks there. Our next speaker will be Robert Rapier. Robert has a master's degree in chemical engineering and has devoted his career to energy-related issues. At various times, he's worked on cellulosic ethanol, butanol production, oil refining, natural gas production, and gas to liquids. Robert has written a number of articles on energy and the environment for various websites, but is primarily associated with the Oil Drum and his R-Squared energy blog. And generally speaking, he's had long been critical of grain-based ethanol, arguing that the environmental and social costs are too high to justify the limited energy return, a remark that David ended with. So this is a good segue. Please welcome Robert Rapier.
Certainly a pleasure to be here today. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. I've had the honor in the last couple of days to shake hands with men like Jim Kunstler, Matthew Simmons, Bob Hirsch, all of who had an enormous influence on my thinking. I had a chance to tell that to Matt and to Jim. I haven't said that to Bob yesterday. Bob, thank you for doing what you do. You've inspired me. I would not be up here today without having been moved to get involved by you gentlemen. This is actually my first ASPO conference. Up until March of this year, I worked for an oil company, and they frowned on my participation. I've been invited before. I was considered a bit of a public relations risk from the oil company's perspective. A number of people the last couple of days have asked me exactly what it is that I do now. I've explained this about 20 times. I'm going to try to save my voice and just explain it once. It's topical to the subject of energy and to carbon capture, which is going to be a topic after the break. I currently am the engineering director for a company that's based in London called Accsys Technologies. And we have commercialized a process called wood acetylation that can take a fast-growing softwood species like pine and turn it into something that's got durability superior to tropical hardwoods. What that means is you can take some of the pressure off of tropical hardwoods, but it also means that the durability is such that we can replace steel and aluminum and even PVC in some applications. In the Netherlands right now, the Dutch government is building a pair of bridges out of our wood instead of steel. So if you think about the implications, we replaced a very high energy intensive process, steel manufacture, with something that's sustainable. And we've sequestered carbon in the process. And that's all I'm going to say about that. If you'd like to know more, I'll talk to you about it later, or you can go to my profile on the oil drum and link back to the company. As you learned, I am associated with the oil drum. I've written articles on oil refining. I've written articles on biofuels, energy policy. I just checked this morning, in the last 2 years, I've written about 150 essays for the oil drum and 631 on my own blog. I get up early in the morning and I write very quickly, and it's something that I enjoy. I've got 20 minutes here to cover the world of biofuels, so I'm going to fly through these slides. I'm not going to speak to the slides. The slides are there for you to read. They're there mainly so somebody looking through this presentation can understand it if all they see is the slides. I'm going to talk about some of the contenders, some of the weaknesses and strengths. I'm going to try to separate some myth from hype and talk a little bit about what's real. One of the topics I was specifically asked to cover is Brazil. I've written a number of essays on Brazil, and I want to speak to why the example of Brazil cannot be extrapolated to the U.S. One of the things I always stress to the people who work for me, the scientists and engineers, that it's important to be critical, but it's also important when you're poking holes in an argument to see if you can help patch those same holes. I don't want to be known as the guy who debunked everything and solved nothing. Therefore, I want to talk a little bit about solutions and some of the contenders that I think have some potential. My message is not abandon hope, and I appreciated Bob Hirsch's optimism yesterday. I'm considered a bit of an optimist, but I think I'm also a realist. One slide on corn ethanol. I've railed on this for years. 3 years ago, I could have stood up here and talked for an hour about this, and I in fact did at the Montana legislature in 2005. I testified against this, and I warned of a food versus fuel crisis. I warned of a lot of the things that we're seeing. I was a crusader at that time. I've moved on. I don't talk about that much because the horse has been beat to death, I think. I think most of you understand where we are with corn ethanol. One thing I do try to tell people is scale. I try to if you take all the ethanol production in the United States, it is still less than some of our larger oil refineries. We have single oil refineries that outproduce every ethanol company in America. And I try to convey that sort of scale to people. When we're trying to scale this up to replace gasoline, you just can't imagine how much oil we use in relation to how much ethanol we're producing. Of course, the infant technology, people tell me we need the subsidies because it's an infant technology. The infant is 30 years old. We've been subsidizing this now for 30 years. Today we have subsidies plus a mandate, which to me is redundant. If you have a mandate, you don't need subsidies. And the reason I think we have the subsidies still is to mask the true costs. And because ethanol, because of the low energy return, it's essentially recycled fossil fuel. By subsidizing ethanol, we're really subsidizing fossil fuel consumption. But then there's an argument that it's just a bridge. The bridge argument presumes that economical cellulosic ethanol is waiting on the other side of the bridge. That's not necessarily the case, in which case we've built the bridge to nowhere. And to that I say thanks, but no thanks. Sugarcane ethanol is a different story. I spent some time in India back in April. I went through a sugarcane ethanol plant. I really grilled them on what it is they were doing. The whole process is keyed upon the bagasse waste, and that's what you see at the bottom. In the manufacture of sugarcane, they produce a tremendous amount of this bagasse waste, and it's really a problem for them to deal with. What this means is they've got boilers that they use to burn this bagasse in, and it's essentially free energy for them to purify to make their ethanol. So most of the companies, they use molasses waste product, and in the U.S. we generally put that on animal feed. In countries like Brazil, India, they take that, ferment it to ethanol, and then use their free energy, essentially, to purify the ethanol. So sugarcane ethanol for tropical countries does have some promise. Are there negatives? Yes. It doesn't scale. I mean, we can't supply the U.S. with Brazilian sugarcane ethanol. It's a solution for Brazil. It's not a solution for the U.S. Cellulosic ethanol. People don't realize we've been working on this problem for 40 years. I worked on this at Texas A&M in the early 90s. This is what my graduate thesis is on. The problem with cellulosic ethanol, there's some serious logistical problems. You can see to operate even a small cellulosic ethanol plant will consume a forest every year. I mean, that's how much biomass it's going to consume. The yields are not good. The concentration of ethanol produced is low, and that, of course, requires copious amounts of energy to separate a 3% ethanol solution up to something that's fuel grade. And my prediction is this will never be commercially viable at scale. Ethanol from biomass gasification is a little bit of a different story. The Renewable Fuel Standard in 2007 co-opted the definition of cellulosic ethanol to include biomass gasification. Now, as a scientist and engineer, this is very annoying to me. It's really about branding. Cellulosic ethanol is about converting cellulose, but in biomass, we have cellulose, hemicellulose, there are lots of sugars and so forth. Biomass gasification gets them all. Gasification can be done on coal, it can be done on natural gas, it can be done on biomass. That's GTL, CTL, BTL processes. Once you make syngas, you can go a number of different directions, so there's a lot more flexibility here. But capital costs are severely a limiting factor there. GTL plants, you know, if you can imagine handling gas, a lot easier than handling biomass, and GTL plants have been shut down due to, or projects have been shut down due to high capital costs. A couple of words on diesel. You all have heard of biodiesel. You may not know that there's a distinct difference between biodiesel, which is an alkyl ester. It has an oxygen molecule. It's a distinct compound from petroleum diesel or hydrocarbon diesel. Green diesel is a hydrocarbon diesel that you produce from biomass, and it can be produced one of two ways. Gasification that I mentioned before, once you have syngas, you can turn that into diesel. This is what the Germans did in World War II to make their fuel, except they used coal. They gasified coal. They turned it into liquid fuels. You can do this with biomass. Hydrocracking uses the same feedstock as biodiesel, oils, vegetable oils, waste oils, but it uses a refining process called hydrotreating, and it cracks those lipids and makes a true hydrocarbon diesel and a propane byproduct. I could have written 6 pages on miscellaneous contenders, but there are a couple that I will speak to. I've often said that the ideal microorganism would eat garbage, excrete gasoline, and can't live outside the lab. This is sort of the path that a company called LS9 down in California, down in Silicon Valley, is working on. This is really the holy grail. It's interesting what they're doing. If you think about it, our bodies produce fats and they produce fatty acids, and it's not a stretch to imagine that they could tweak those metabolic pathways to actually produce a hydrocarbon that would essentially phase out of water. And water is an enemy for biofuels. It takes a lot of energy to get water out. If you have a process that can phase this fuel out, if you have a hydrocarbon, it will phase out, and you've got a low energy intensive separation. Dimethyl ether, it's interesting because it can be converted from methanol, which is easy to make from biomass gasification. The Chinese are really taking the lead here. They're building a lot of plants, and that's as a home for their coal reserves. Butanol, I have a soft spot for butanol. I worked the first 6 years of my career on butanol. The biobutanol process was put out of business by the petrochemical process, and the reason is simple. The biobutanol process results in a very, very dilute concentration of butanol. It's less than 2%, 98% water. If your goal is to produce a specialty chemical, you may be willing to spend 3 or 4 BTUs to make a BTU of butanol. If your goal is to produce fuel, you're not going to do that. You're going to use those 3 or 4 BTUs directly, and this is why biobutanol has a long ways to go before it's ever going to be viable. It does phase out of solution at concentrations of 8% or so, but right now 2% is toxic to the bugs. So they're a long ways from being able to scale up and produce biobutanol for fuel. Now, some contenders that I think have some promise, people ask me sometimes, you know, what's the most pressing problem to be solved? The most pressing problem, in my opinion, is storage. If you have storage, that's an enabling technology for many different technologies, solar, geothermal, wind. You store solar energy for use at night, you've gone a long ways toward solving our energy problems. Some of the miscellaneous contenders, I won't go through there because the timer of death is at 7 minutes now. So one thing I want to talk about, this is the most important thing I think I want to discuss. Can we emulate Brazil? Because you've heard politicians say it, you've heard newsmen say it. Brazil set a goal, and they achieved that goal, and now they're energy independent because of ethanol. You've all heard that. Here's a reality check. Oil usage in Brazil is still more than 10 times the usage of ethanol in Brazil. Oil supplies more than 90% of Brazil's energy usage, and they did, in fact, celebrate energy independence in 2006. They celebrated on that ship, the president of Brazil, when the Albacora Leste field came in, and they celebrated it because of their oil reserves. That's why they celebrate energy independence. Now, the reality check when trying to scale this up to the U.S. gets a lot worse. Let those figures soak in for just a minute. We have an enormous gap between what we use and what we produce. Brazil has a very small gap between what they use and what they produce, and up until recently, they filled that gap with a little bit of imports and with ethanol. If we really want to be like Brazil, we have to cut our oil consumption by 75%, so it's equivalent to what we make. That's how we be like Brazil, or we quadruple our oil production. We don't fill that gap with ethanol. It's not possible. I want to go into a couple of cases here of technology hype run amok. You may remember in 2003 the TDP story, thermal depolymerization. They're going to make 4 billion barrels of light Texas crude. You probably can't read that graphic, but it essentially shows that they're going to turn plastic bottles, heavy oil, medical waste into light, sweet Texas crude. From the May 2003 Discover, they just gushed over this technology. You know, the price was right. They had cool buzzwords. You know, the cast was, it was like it was cast out of Hollywood. Awards and accolades rained down, and the article essentially read like science fiction, which it was. Discover updated this in 2006, and it turned out they were a bit too aggressive in their projections. Instead of making oil for $8 a barrel, they made it for $80 a barrel, and this was when oil was trading at 40. So they had a few problems there. What should they have learned? It all boils down to this. It's very difficult to scale things up out of the lab to commercial scale. And media people, companies, they sometimes don't appreciate this. They take a lab result and immediately they extrapolate that to our energy solution. Killing cancer in the lab is easy. It's not the same as curing cancer. Fast forward 2008, I won't name names, but a company has come out and made very similar claims, and it looks like I'm reading TDP all over again. Ethanol for $1 a gallon. Some of you know who that is. I won't go into details The technology has only been partially demonstrated in the lab, but already the hype is running amok once again. Algal biodiesel. There's a man here at the conference, John Benneman. He's got a display outside. I refer to him as the man who wrote the book on algal biodiesel. He authored the report here, the closeout report on the aquatic species program. For many years, the Department of Energy funded a study to see if we can run the U.S. on algae. And they shut the program down in the late 90s. What John told me is the only quote there that's accurate is the middle one. He said that his portion of the report was edited somewhat. He's referred to this as an interesting research project and said, again, this is speculation run amok here. The issue is not that the technology doesn't work. It does work. It's just, I'll give you an example. There's $10 trillion worth of gold in the ocean. The technology exists to get it out, but it'll cost more than $10 trillion to get it out, so you can't do it. And we've known this for over 100 years that all that gold is there. John referred to this as Photoshop technology. This, you know, if you put this on the surface, if you put this on the surface of Mars, it really wouldn't change the plausibility much. I mean, it's that far-fetched. This doesn't exist. These photobioreactors that you see in pictures like this, they cost some $100 a square meter, and in a square meter you can expect to produce about 1 gallon of biodiesel a year. That's the problem with those systems. And that shows you the order of magnitude that we have to breach before this is economical. It hasn't stopped companies from going out and selling stocks and scamming investors. That's been done. De Beers Fuels did it, not to be confused with the Diamond Company, but they went out, they scammed investors, said they were going to be making algal biodiesel, and they took a lot of investors for a ride. And the reason they were able to is because all the hype out there on algal biodiesel and people not being able to separate that hype from reality. Okay, 2 minutes left. I think I'm going to make it. I get really frustrated with politicians, those in the audience, of course, excepted. They could do so much in pushing us down the right paths, but it does take political courage. Where do they go wrong? They mislead the public, and they mislead the public sometimes because they don't know any better, sometimes because of vested interests, but we've got to have political courage here. Solutions. Again, the politicians have got to cease the delusions of cheap gas for everyone. It is maddening to me to hear politicians say we have to reduce our fossil fuel consumption on one hand, and on the other, we need to tap into the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to reduce prices. That doesn't mesh. The people who are suggesting we need to reduce fossil fuel consumption should look back at what happened when gas prices spiked. People started to abandon SUVs. They started to take mass transit. Fossil fuel prices don't need to go down. They need to go up. We need to increase fossil fuel taxes. There's ways to do that without being regressive. We can rebate income taxes. You know, there are ways to sell this. There are many ways to sell this if you tell the story in the right way. We have to do this. The market's going to do it for us. If we do it in a way that allows us to plan, we'll be in a lot better shape than if we, again, run up to $5, $6 gasoline next year. Eventually, it'll crush the economy, if it hasn't already. Oil companies haven't been perfect. I've worked for an oil company for years. It's very frustrating for me that oil companies are out there supplying energy for the world, and they are just, there's so much animosity toward the oil companies. They are the ones that are experienced in delivering mass volumes of energy. Do we really want ExxonMobil to up and move to Dubai? I mean, I don't think so. I mean, we're going to need those companies to avoid going down the steep depletion curve. And finally, that's my last slide. We've got to encourage behaviors that reduce energy consumption. There are many, many different paths we can go down here, but you know, I list a couple: rebates for solar water heaters, fuel-efficient cars, etc. Those are some of the things that we have to do. And again, 20 minutes. I can't peel the onion very much on the world of biofuels, but that's a very superficial look, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about it. Thank you.
Robert, thank you very much for the whirlwind tour. It was a fine one. Our last speaker on the panel before we get to Q&A, and actually we'll have a little more time for Q&A than I thought because I rushed the start here. Andy Weissman was introduced to you yesterday, just for those who were coming in new today, and there were some. Andy is the editor-in-chief and publisher of Energy Business Watch, a highly regarded marketing advisory service that provides in-depth cutting-edge analysis of the U.S. and global oil and natural gas markets. He's an expert in the U.S. and global oil and gas, electricity, and coal markets, commodity trading. He was involved in setting up the trading's emissions credits in the U.S. and negotiating some of the early path-breaking deals. Please welcome Andy Weissman.
Thanks very much, Steve. In the interest of time, I think I'm going to skip the first few of my slides, some of which I covered yesterday, and go right to some of the core issues. As we discussed yesterday, much of my presentation is going to focus on the issues of the risks associated with the natural gas and electricity sectors, because those are more than half of our total energy supply. And basically, where we stand now is that unless we make some radical changes, we're at high risk, essentially, that within several years, all our energy costs could essentially go to parity or even potentially a premium to the price of oil. And if you believe, as I think many in this room believe, that there is a high risk that oil prices will go substantially higher over time, that's a pretty scary thought. And especially where we stand now, and essentially what the core issue is, from my standpoint, as someone who's spent his whole career focusing on issues pertaining to electricity supply and natural gas in the United States, is that where we stand now is that the path we're on is that the expected marginal source of supply for the natural gas market in the United States, and therefore, in effect, the expected marginal source of supply for electricity in the United States is imports of LNG. And that essentially, as I'll explain in more detail as I go on, if that's what happens, I think what's probably most predictable is that not immediately, because near term there is a great deal of LNG supply coming on the market and there may be some softening of prices. But by as soon as 3 or 4 years from now, we're going to move into a situation where global demand for LNG is almost certainly going to significantly exceed global supply, and that problem is going to get worse and worse and worse. And so if we allow ourselves to be in a situation where natural gas supply in the United States and therefore electricity supply in the United States become dependent on imports of LNG as we move further into the next decade, we are in about as dangerous a situation as you can possibly imagine. We're literally talking about the potential of, by 2013, 2014, 2015, natural gas prices going up to the level of $20, $25, $30 per million BTU, and electricity prices potentially doubling or tripling from the levels that we are now. And that potentially would cause something on the order of $500 billion a year shock to the U.S. economy and potentially have a devastating effect on the manufacturing sector in the United States. So we're talking about really major scale problems that unfortunately would be coinciding with potentially severe shocks in the oil sector. So that's the problem. And the question is how we deal with it. And the problem is made particularly severe because there's every likelihood that as we move out over time, demand for natural gas in the United States is going to explode. Now again, on the one hand, I'm not talking about a problem that's going to happen tomorrow, because we actually may see very near term in 2009 and 2010 a leveling off of natural gas demand and potentially even a softening of natural gas prices in the United States. And I'll talk about the reasons for that in a little bit. But don't be fooled by that, because as I emphasized yesterday, the plan, and as I think all of you recognize, the planning horizon to deal with 2012 and 2013 and 2014 and 2015 is right now. The actions that we have to take, if anything, should have started 2 or 3 years from now. And as you start looking even just to 2011 and 2012, the demand for natural gas in the United States is likely to explode. Now, why do I say that? Well, first of all, there's some key things to recognize. Actually, when I first spoke with Steve and others about the planning for today's conference, Steve said, I hope that you bring a baseball bat with you. And I literally thought about doing that on the topic of essentially beating up on EIA. And essentially, again, I really have a deep respect for a lot of the individuals at EIA. In a lot of sense, really, Guy Caruso and Howard Grunspeck have done a lot in the 5 years that they've been at the agency to make improvements, given some of given the severe limitations on staff, on resources that they have, and given the kind of the natural tendency that every organization has to try to defend the projections they've already made. But essentially, they don't get it as an institution in terms of trying to understand supply and demand of natural gas in the United States. And as one area where they've been particularly far off is that they're not even close in predicting growth in power sector demand for natural gas, which in fact, for years now, has been the key driver of demand for natural gas in the United States. And just to give you some sense of it, and I won't try to go through this in any great detail, but if you look at the graph on the left, if you can see starting in 2007 or so, if you look at the dark blue part of the bars there at the bottom, those are, I'm sorry, my eyesight is so bad, I guess I should start you in 2006. If you look at the dark blue bar in 2006, and the dark blue bars that extend across there, those are their February 2006 estimates of what power sector demand for natural gas would be in 2006 and subsequent years. And the full heights of the bars in 2006, 2007, and 2008 show you actual demand for actual use of natural gas in the power sector. Now, I cut off the scale at the bottom, so you've got to look at the scale carefully, but the bottom line of that graph is they weren't off by a little bit. They've been off by 1 trillion cubic feet or more. And more importantly, they got the whole pattern completely wrong. Frankly, I wrote an article in 2003 that said essentially we were likely to see on average 450 BCF a year over year growth in natural gas consumption in the power sector every year for the rest of this decade. And that's pretty much what's happened. EIA 2 years ago was still essentially saying power sector consumption was going to continuously be flat. And what you can see is that that is about as far, if you look at the first 5 bars there, it just, everybody in the electric utility industry understood that's not going to happen. Now, the reasons they were so far off are complex. I've written articles about that. The fundamental point is that they are vastly far off. They don't get it. They drastically underestimate power sector use. And unfortunately, it's not just looking backward. If you look at their most recent long-term projection of power sector use, they are today projecting that 83% of all the incremental growth in power sector, in electricity supply in the United States between now and 2030 will come from expanded generation of electricity using coal. And I think all of us would say, looking at what's happening around in the country, that essentially, while there might be some who would hope that that's exactly what happens, and there might be some economic benefits if that happens, that right now the likelihood of that happening is probably near zero. So for EIA to publish projections that assume that virtually all our growth in electricity supply is going to come from expanded use of coal, in my mind, is at this point kind of fairy tale land. It just has no chance of coming. But the likelihood instead, and what's actually happening right now, is essentially utilities all around the country are committing to build more gas-fired generation. And so what you already see, there's a little bit of a taste of this in EIA's projections that in 2008 are showing, in their most recent projections, are showing, at least as you get out of time, that they're starting to show some significant growth in natural gas use in the power sector. But if you look at the National Electric Reliability Corporation's projections, even 11 months ago, they were showing far greater gas-fired additions than EIA is showing in projections that were issued just 10, 12 weeks ago. And that was NERC projections almost a year ago. If you look at what utilities are really doing, they are committing to far more gas-fired generation, and we're really essentially certain to see far greater growth in gas use in the utility sector, and that's even if there is no federal climate change legislation. If we get federal climate change legislation, the gas use in the power industry will go through the roof, because that be essentially, for at least for a period of 10 or 15 years, there will be no other way to comply with radical restrictions. There are some, many analyses that show a large percentage of the coal-fired plants in the United States might have to be shut down by as early as 2016. The more fundamental, broader problem, though, irrespective of what scenario you assume about what might happen with environmental legislation, is that much as on the oil side, essentially what's going on right now is something we shouldn't tolerate. Namely, that essentially we are currently flying blind. We are currently working in a near total information vacuum where, just as in the oil sector, a lot of decision making is occurring based upon estimates of future demand as well as estimates of future supply that are just numbers written down on paper that in fact have no validity and substance to them. And if you do any kind of detailed, accurate analysis, what it will show you is that we don't have a good handle on precisely what natural gas consumption is going to be in the future, but during the next decade, it's almost certainly going to explode. And what's particularly frightening is we've lived this story in the past. During the past decade, we turned to natural gas in the power sector. We built a huge number of gas-fired units. We did it expecting the supply would be there. It wasn't. We paid a huge price in terms of increased costs and in terms of a huge loss of manufacturing jobs in the United States. Now, given this potential problem, what are the potential solutions? How can we avoid being caught in a situation where we don't have adequate domestic supply and we wind up having to turn to LNG with the impacts I described? Essentially, sorry, I shouldn't have skipped so quickly over the last slide. Essentially, in terms of what people think of as being the options that are available now, they're essentially 5 that are available and that people talk about, and I'm going to try to go through each of them briefly. First of all, there is no question that in terms of what one optimally would want to do from a planning standpoint, the area where, in theory, there is the most potential to kind of make huge inroads on the problem most quickly, it is by improvements in energy efficiency, reductions in energy consumption. There is no question that that is, in theory, where the most low-hanging fruit is, and therefore clearly an area that we need to focus on very hard. A few comments, though. First of all, it's an area we've been focusing on a long time. If you look at the actual progress right now there's some, but it's not very dramatic. And the issues we're focusing on right now often are issues about how do you provide better incentives for utilities. What I would argue is that if we're going to get serious about this area, we have to take a whole new approach. We have to realize that to really make a contribution, again, it's an issue of scale, we have to clean the slate, develop an out-of-the-box approach. We need to do radical things. We need to find ways to rebuild a significant amount of our infrastructure. We need, for example, to rebuild a significant amount of all the commercial office space in the United States, refurbish it in a way that it's far more energy efficient. We need potentially to replace a significant portion of all the refrigerators and HVAC systems in the United States. And no one is yet, on a national level, really, in my mind, focusing on, we need to convene a conference, perhaps, of how do we come up with a whole out-of-the-box series of approaches, what kind of goals can we set for really major reductions in a short period of time. But even if we do something and come up with far more aggressive goals, what I would also suggest is that we need to look at, as Matt pointed out yesterday, this is all about risks. And we need to realize that what the pattern so far shows is that we tend to fall way short of our goals, and we need to ask what the risks are associated with that. And the risks are really twofold. As I indicated yesterday, when we fall short on energy supply, what the lesson of the first few months of this year in particular are, what happens is that energy prices shoot through the roof. And the reason that happens is the only way that market can balance is for prices to go high enough to destroy additional demand. And we've been going through that process long enough so that it now takes steeper and steeper price increases to eliminate additional demand. And the further problem is that it's generally not, to a large degree, the people in this room who suffer from that. It tends to be even more those who are weaker and can protect themselves more. And so we have to ask the question, I believe, that while many of us have a dream of trying to rely on energy efficiency as being potentially the cure-all, we have to ask what the risks are and who's at risk if we rely too heavily on that as the solution. And we have to focus on what's a comprehensive plan that minimizes our overall risks. Now, the second answer that people are looking to recently is the question of what potentially can be done with shale development. And they look at that in particular because we've had huge growth in U.S. production of natural gas recently. I think it's important to realize that while we've had huge growth in production, that is largely because of a very fortunate set of coincidences, which I've listed on the slides, on this slide here, and which are not sustainable. Essentially, a lot of good things all happened at the same time in 2007 and early 2008. And some of those things will continue to a degree, but the super rate of growth that we've had over the last 12 to 18 months is probably not sustainable. And while we've had a spectacular growth in onshore production, what we've also seen that should be a huge warning sign is that even though we've seen some of the highest prices in the U.S., we've seen LNG imports shrink to the lowest level in 5 years, and actually there have been reports in the last couple of weeks that there have been periods when there was literally zero LNG on the waters headed to the U.S. market. Pretty striking. And again, that may change next year in terms of LNG, because essentially most of the LNG that's production that's being added anywhere in the world in the next decade, or at least a large share of it, is coming online in the next 24 to 36 months. And so we may have a temporary period globally where there's excess supply. But that is not going to last very long. A lot of the attention lately has been on the shale formations. I've heard very very high level of pessimism here yesterday about whether we're going to get any significant contribution at all. I believe we need to take a little bit more of a wait-and-see attitude. You know, on the Barnett Shale, 3 or 4 years ago, people didn't think that there was much potential at all. And I think there is some possibility that we could see some particularly significant growth with the other new emerging shale plays. I think the more important point, though, is to realize, first of all, we really don't know what the full potential is there. It is, at this point, a very new area. What the graph at the left shows you is that the growth that's occurred, there has been huge growth in unconventional production in the United States, but virtually all of it so far has been from areas other than the newly emerging shale plays that are getting so much discussion. What the graph shows you is that almost the great majority of it has been the purple and the greenish color, which are tight sands and coal bed methane. The rest of it has almost all been Barnett Shale, and only that tiny wedge at the very top has been what we've actually done so far from the other emerging shale plays, many of which really, some of which, Haynesville, for example, while it shows some real promise, is really an area that's just started to really been explored seriously this year. And even Barnett Shale, two of the leading producers, Devon and EOG Resources, both are of the view that production in Barnett Shale may peak as early as the first quarter of next year. And so essentially, we really have to take a wait-and-see attitude with respect to the other shale plays. We need a lot more evidence to know what the production might be there. And just as significantly, we need to put it in a broader overall context. And the broader overall context, specifically, is that there is every likelihood that even if there were no major contribution from those emerging plays, we'd see most other sources decline rapidly over the course of the next decade. These are what the EIA projections show. If there's in fact major growth in the emerging shale plays, that in all likelihood would put a lot of further downward pressure in production from these areas. And further, given what's likely to exist near term, where we may see downward pressure on prices near term, because we're going to go through for a lot of different reasons, we actually may see a situation where production in all the areas lags in 2009 and 2010, just before demand is likely to explode. And finally, with the shale areas themselves, there are a lot of specific reasons to have question marks, which I've tried to list on this slide. And why is that particularly troubling? If you look worldwide, there is a good chunk of the world that is essentially committed to a strategy similar to what we're committed to now without fully realizing it, where in reality, if you strip through if you look at it, essentially the most likely source for future electricity supply is primarily increased utilization of natural gas. And a lot of that natural gas is expected to come from LNG. And if you look at LNG, that's shown in part by the huge number of terminals that are being built around the world. If you look at LNG supply on the right, what you'll see is that while there is a fair amount of production coming online in the next 24 to 36 months, that in fact there's very, very little behind it in the queue. Now, in terms of other potential sources of supply, it's just very, very briefly because of time, nuclear, very little, a wonderful potential source. I've done a lot of work in nuclear in my life. Very unlikely we're going to see enough added anytime in the next decade to make a difference. Huge problems just because of the huge amount of capital that's required relative to the scale size of the utility industry. Very hard to see how we can have enough added anytime in the next 10, 12, 15 years to make a really major contribution. Wind, critical issue. Essentially the core problem associated with wind now, until there's a storage technology, is that the wind often doesn't blow during the middle of the day in hot times of year. That is a critical issue. It's not taken into account adequately in many analyses of the contribution that wind can make. But the bottom line is that until that's solved, that may severely limit the amount of wind that realistically can be added. Now, where does that leave us? From my perspective, at least, it means that there might be a huge cost unless we at least look a whole lot more closely at coal. Now, David outlined, I think, in a lot of detail and well, the size of the resource and the potential. What the issue boils down to a large degree, is the question of sequestration. And I think David raised a number of very important points with respect to that. But I guess I would ask this question, and I will end there. An awful lot of the discussion that I've heard over time, I think may focus on what, at least personally, I would consider to be not necessarily the right issue. And specifically what I mean by that is that the issue often in many debates focuses on whether we should be for or against coal. And I would say this, at this point, I think the sentiment in this country is clear, and frankly, I'm not aware of many, even within industry, who have a very different view. And that is that it's very unlikely that we would go forward with any coal, certainly on any significant scale, without also going forward on sequestration. So I think the issue essentially is, what should we be doing with respect to sequestration? And with respect to that issue in particular, I think what's been happening is extremely unfortunate. I'm with Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia, who advises Kofi Annan, among others, who's said that essentially what's been going on now borders on the immoral. And what I mean by that in particular, when we listened to yesterday's presentation on China in particular, and David covered some of the same issues very well as well, whether you think it's a good idea or the worst thing in the world, there are huge increases that have occurred, are occurring, and inevitably are going to continue to occur in the amount of coal that's being used. If you are concerned about the effects that that has at all, either the effects on CO2 emissions, or there was mention yesterday of mercury deposition in California from coal-fired plants, one needs to be concerned about what that means in terms of how coal is utilized. And I think many people would say, essentially, that that means we may have a responsibility to try very hard to see what can be done with sequestration. The MIT study that David cited on the future of coal says there are no apparent obstacles. A lot of people disagree. But I don't think there's any excuse for not making an all-out effort to try to develop it and test it and see whether it works. It may work, it may not, but if it does, then potentially coal-fired projects become a relatively low-carbon source of energy that potentially is more moderate in cost than other sources. One has to take into account all the costs, as David pointed out, but in a world that may be very scarce of energy, it still may be a critical source to meet our overall needs. And so I would feel that we'd be making a big mistake if we don't pursue that very aggressively. Thank you.
Three fine presentations with now a whole lot of questions in hand to address them. Two quick things. For those of you, the room is tilted. People who came in late, there are tables up here with just 2 or 3 people. You're welcome to migrate in that direction. Second thing, the next panel will actually focus on the carbon story much more. So what we are going to do is defer the questions, and I got a number of them, on that topic, primarily to that next panel. There are plenty of good questions to deal with the other issues here. Start with you, Robert, regarding let's see, sugarcane ethanol, if the crop residue in the form of bagasse is not at least partially returned to the soil and is burned as fuel instead, is the process sustainable in the long term? Question from Kent Mueller.
Okay, I can tell you exactly what they do in India because I focused on this. I was very focused on just what the level of sustainability is. They do burn the bagasse. They've also got a lot of waste that they actually compost. And the bagasse, when it burns, you have some ash content, and that's the minerals that have been pulled out of the soil. And they take those minerals, that ash, and they mix it with the compost that they've also produced in the process, and they return all of that back to the soil. Is that long-term sustainable? Is there some mineral missing that volatilizes? Perhaps. It's a much better situation than corn ethanol, where we're strip mining the soil at a very rapid rate. You know, it remains to be seen. I haven't seen I've seen some life cycle analyses around Brazilian sugarcane ethanol. There was one done in Europe a couple of years ago, and their conclusion was the process is sustainable.
Okay, thank you. David, what is your outlook for world coal exports?
I suspect they're going to be pretty tight. I mentioned right at the outset that China is now a slight net importer of coal, the largest coal producer in the world. India is a larger net importer of coal. They just bought a share in 2 mines in Indonesia. The U.S. is a slight net exporter of coal at this point on an energy basis. But if you look at those charts that I showed you of peaking, it is a question of more investment could raise U.S. coal production, but I suspect prices are going to remain high and supplies tight.
Andy, if Barnett Shale is so large, why might it be peaking already?
What's happened with all the gas fields in the United States is as seismic technologies have become more effective, the industry has done a pretty good job of identifying the best resources to tackle quickly. And with the Barnett Shale in particular, the industry has been continuously improving techniques for horizontal drilling and fracking and has been doing a tremendous job of finding the best reserves with great sweet spots where they can move in and extract large amounts of gas, often in the first 3 to 6 months, but where the decline rate goes down very, very rapidly. And we may be reaching a point, there's also been a very rapid ramp up in drilling, and we're reaching a point where there's been a huge pop in production because of a very rapid ramp up of drilling and great success in tapping some reserves with great sweet spots, but given the decline rate, it may not be possible to continue to find targets that can replace the gas that's being lost due to the decline rate.
This was a question that reminds me that the slides, again, will be posted. I haven't gone on the site myself yet, but all these presentations will be online through the ASPO-USA website. The question was here, David, who was the author of the Why Complex Societies Collapse? I believe that was Joseph Tainter, but that kind of information, again, will be accessible soon. David, though, another question. Do you have specific policy recommendations for downsizing overall energy consumption and a planned descent to avoid collapse on a world or North American scale? Jim Mullerin.
Yeah, I've got a whole list. I think one of the first things to realize that the North American way of life cannot be propagated to the number of people that are on the planet. There's no way, shape, or form. You saw how large North American per capita consumption is compared even to Europe. I don't think there's enough energy on the planet to get the world's population at present even up to European standards. I doubt it very much. So we have to look at a lot of different fronts. First of all, forget business as usual. I think one of the good news items about North America is there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in the way we consume energy. There's a lot of efficiencies that can be made, but we have to think about rethinking infrastructure. Go back to Kunstler's long emergency and suburbia, and how a lot of our infrastructure has been built on the assumption of cheap energy. And that has to change. A whole rethink of how we design communities, using fuels for their highest value use for society. That's why, coal is a relatively low value fuel in terms of the diversity of different things it can be used for. I mean, you can make liquids out of it, but that's a very capital and energy intensive and long-term process to build the infrastructure. So coal is well suited for things like electricity. We have to be very intelligent about the way we use it to reduce emissions as much as possible. But I think, number one at the top of the list is knock down consumption, intelligent deployment of renewables, through tax incentives, some of the things that are being done here in California for photovoltaics. Realize the scale problems. Don't think that there's any silver bullet out there. There isn't. There's a whole bunch of different little things, but it's not impossible.
Robert, where is net energy analysis on the assessment of biomass energy? I got several questions on that. What is the theoretical EROEI for cellulosic ethanol and algae biodiesel? What are the chances that we'll ever break even? So it's a broad area there. Go for it.
Yeah, there are energy analyses on some of the biofuels. Some of them are really lacking, and some of them have made wild extrapolations. The ones you'll see on cellulosic ethanol are all making a number of assumptions, one of which you'll take the waste and you'll burn it for fuel. This has never been demonstrated. When you see someone claim that the energy return for cellulosic ethanol is 8 to 1 or 10 to 1, that's crap. That's not ever been demonstrated. That is merely theoretical. Now for Brazilian sugarcane ethanol, you'll often see that the energy return is claimed at 8 to 1. That's not really true either. That's based on the fossil fuel inputs. If you're looking just to fossil fuel, it does have a very high energy return. But what that 8 to 1 doesn't count is actually the bagasse that was burned. The actual energy inputs may be less BTU-wise than what you get back out of it, but because the bagasse is essentially waste, it exaggerates the energy return. The question is then, could you have used the bagasse for something else? Could you have used it to make electricity if it's truly waste? And I mean, I've been down to Louisiana, talked to the sugarcane guys down there. I've seen just mountains of this stuff, and they've just said, please help us find a solution for this. Even when they burn it for power, they burn it to fuel their ethanol factories, and they've still got just mountains of it to get rid of that sometimes they just burn. You've seen assessments on corn ethanol that are all over the place. Some of those I've really brutalized in some of my essays because some of them are very, very misleading. The USDA has done some work that I consider to be highly misleading, where they, for instance, ethanol also makes dried distillers grains. And the USDA figured out a few years ago that if they hide energy inputs in those dried distillers grains, they can exaggerate the energy return. That's where they came up with the famous 1.67 or 1.7 energy return. But if you look at the whole picture and you take the DDGS out of it, the actual liquid fuel energy return for the energy inputs for the USDA was about a 5% energy gain. But you'll hear corn ethanol proponents claim the 1.7, and it's not remotely accurate. It's a sleight of hand is what I've called it.
It would seem to anyone thinking about the energy return question that if we're working with oil that has a 30 to 1 or 15 to 1 or whatever return, and we're arguing about is ethanol from corn 1.05, 1.7, 1.5, 1.3, were in deep pasture paddies, as my colleague Randy Udall likes to say. Andy, here's a rhetorical question for you that's kind of fun. Michael Lynch said that LNG costs of $3.50 a million BTU. I remember those days. Some people in the room had more hair then. $3.50 BTU would put a ceiling or a cap on natural gas prices. Do you think he was wrong? Okay, you don't need to spend time on that one. Here's a good one. Isn't the Mackenzie River stranded gas a simple enough source for 5 to 10 years? I'm not quite sure what that means, but perhaps you can comment on that. And the second part is, what does Boone Pickens mean when he says natural gas is abundant?
Well, on Mackenzie Valley, one of the things I think is probably a good lesson in terms of timing is that I remember when I first was speaking out on the potential for a natural gas crisis in the United States in 2002, that essentially, if I recall correctly, one of the reasons that was cited as to why there wouldn't be a major natural gas problem is that the projected completion date for Mackenzie Valley at that point was 2006. And of course, at this point, it's very, very unclear whether the project will even be started, given the huge escalation that's occurred in the cost of the pipeline. And I think that is very indicative of kind of two things. One, that every time we see a target date for any of these projects, any large-scale project like this, what it usually indicates is essentially the initial hopes of the sponsors as to when the project might be completed. And I mentioned yesterday, I alluded to a study that Simmons and Company published in July regarding the likelihood that non-OPEC production would decline fairly significantly. And part of that was to just study all the a large sampling of recent major oil projects and to show systematically both that the completion dates were delayed even more than IEA is currently assuming, and that the peak production wound up being very significantly below what was projected. And I think that's endemic to all these projects, and it's part of why we've seen LNG supplies fall far below what was expected near term, and it's what makes it even scarier that right now there aren't all that many LNG projects in the queue once you get past those that are already under construction now. So, you know, I think all that is very sobering, where we're in a world where what we is much more certain is that we aren't building enough alternative sources of generation, both in the United States and also elsewhere, and very soon, by 2012, 2013, et cetera, we need alternative sources of energy, and therefore what energy, we need new sources of electricity supply is perhaps what I should say, and what electricity suppliers all around the world are actually planning to do in order to meet that is the only thing they can do, which is to take combustion turbines, which are basically jet engines, and strap them to the ground, assuming that there will be natural gas supply to operate them. And essentially, we can talk all we want about what all of us ideally would like to see happen in terms of ways of reducing demand, et cetera, et cetera. But essentially, to keep the lights on, the electricity service providers are assuming that the gas will be there, and if it's not, there are potentially extreme things that could happen. Now, on Boone Pickens and supply, Again, I think he, as I mentioned yesterday, I think he deserves tremendous credit in a sense for thinking out of the box regarding solutions and thinking across media, in effect, by thinking not narrowly about transportation fuel supply, but trying to integrate transportation and stationary sources. But his proposal was more than a little of what I had in mind in saying that we need to bring to bear drastically more expertise in evaluating our energy supply options. Frankly, he's probably a whole lot more knowledgeable than the members of Congress who actually do formulate energy supply strategy. I think that he's getting a fair amount of attention for a proposal that, A, would involve, starts with the premise that if we, again, I'm rattling on too long, that would involve spending $1 trillion on wind without any real understanding of whether it's feasible and without any evaluation of whether that's the most cost-effective approach is probably telling us something. As to abundant natural gas, you'd have to ask him what kind of study he's done and whether he's really taken into account the factors that I tried to identify in my presentation.
Okay, we'll do, Robert, you'll get the last two, but before that, I'm pitching a question from Shell Alaclet to David. Future coal needs to go deeper, as in China. I think it's a statement. How will this affect production, as in drilling deeper, accessing deeper resources?
Well, coal has an energy return on investment food chain, just like natural gas, biofuels, all of it. I started in the coal business in 1972, and at that point we were looking at some incredibly attractive surface coal mines, 20-meter thick seams, 10-to-1 or less strip ratios. Those are all mined out. Now we're going after thinner seams, a much lower but still high energy return on investment. So as we go deeper and deeper, the EROI is going to go down, and it's going to take more and more effort in terms of manpower, machines, likely to keep production even flat. So if we don't have that investment, we can expect production to fall.
And Robert, you want to take those?
Okay. Got two here. Francis DeWinter, a comment and a question. Ethanol as a gasoline replacement may be hopeless. How about ethanol as a gasoline octane booster? Is there any alternative? Tetraethyl lead is not a viable choice. I worked in a refinery in Billings, Montana for 3 years, and one of the things I did was blend gasoline. And there are lots of options for boosting octane. And even though I had notes, one of the things I forgot to say is even corn ethanol may have a place. Its place is not to rapidly scale up and produce ethanol in Iowa for consumption in California. That's not viable. As a local octane booster in Iowa, that may be a great choice for corn ethanol, but not at scale, not at massive scale, not when people are taking land out of the CRP and using those marginal lands to make ethanol, which is what's happening right now. Second one from John Benneman. Again, if you've got questions on algae biodiesel, I would advise you to step out. John's got a display outside and speak with him. He wanted me to clarify that algae are good for wastewater treatment and that you can produce fuel that way and you can recover nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers. And I don't want you to go away with the impression that algal biodiesel is completely hopeless. As John said, it's a good research project. It's an interesting place to research. What I want to do is address some of the rampant hype here, because what I think that serves to do is delay action. If we think that cellulosic ethanol is going to scale up and replace all of our gasoline consumption, as Vinod Khosla will tell you, what's the problem? We don't have a problem. We just need to put more money into funding cellulosic ethanol, more subsidies, and that's really all we have to do, and the rest will take care of itself.
I'll end with a note that we did have a number of questions on renewables. Can wind power be considered a means of reducing the use of natural gas for power generation? How soon can we expect solar and wind to replace coal and natural gas as the energy of our existing power grid? If you wanted to do really quick bullet fire-offs to that, you're welcome to do so. But I wanted to let people know that we understand those questions came in, and the afternoon is really going to be focused on renewables. But maybe you guys want to throw out some cherry bombs and say yes, no, or maybe.
I don't think there's a hope we can replace hydrocarbons as they're used currently with renewables like PV or wind. I think we have to face the fact that we need to scale down a lot. We have to recognize the intermittency issues with both of those forms of renewables. However, they are very useful. PV are very useful for low-intensity applications like residential. And some of the tax rebates and incentives and things like net metering, using the grid as a storage medium, we can do a lot more than we are now with renewables, but forget business as usual replacement of hydrocarbons. We have to get over that.
One quick comment at all?
No,
Got to be quick, anything? Okay. Well, we will, maybe David gave some ammo to the afternoon sessions. They'll be taking those bullets and firing back with it. You've got a 25-minute break. See you back in here at 10:15 sharp. Thank you. Thank our wonderful panelists, by the way. Superb job. Guys, that was a lot of information. Thank you very much. Great job.